Lecture 7, Tips for Note-Taking. One of the simplest recommendations for successful learning is to write it down. Many of us can relate to the experience of thinking, I will surely remember this, only to realize sometime later that we didn't. Research shows that human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially when it comes to details. And this is largely because our minds can only process so much information at once. That's why taking notes can improve both comprehension and retention of information. The act of note-taking forces us to pay attention, which increases the likelihood that we truly engage with the content, as opposed to drifting off and thinking about other things. Note-taking also provides us with a written, external record that we can use to check our understanding or to test our memory later on, such as when we're preparing for an exam. However, note-taking is a skill. The quality of our notes matters. And a lot of research suggests that many of us just aren't very good at it, even after years of practice. For example, research with college students suggests that their notes are usually incomplete and sometimes even inaccurate, and that students often struggle with discerning relevant information from irrelevant information. So even though they're taking notes, it doesn't always benefit them as much as it could. As a college professor, I've seen these problems firsthand. Even experienced, relatively successful students have trouble taking good notes. Effective note-taking is not quite as routine or as mindless as many people assume. And so in this lecture, we are going to delve into principles of effective note-taking. And I'll give some practical advice for how you can take notes that are likely to be more valuable to your learning and memory. There's no one best system of note-taking, but there are some important considerations and strategies that have been shown to be more effective than others. Let's start with some overarching principles of effective note-taking, and then I'll provide some specific recommendations for how to take good notes while reading versus taking notes during a live lecture. The first principle of good note-taking is to simply do it, even when you think you don't have to. As I said before, our memories are notoriously unreliable, and we've all had the experience of forgetting something that we thought we'd surely remember, like forgetting a password that we just updated, or forgetting the name of that book we wanted to read, let alone information that might be less personally relevant, like a mathematical formula. Just because you were physically present and understood something in the moment does not mean you will remember it later, especially when it comes to details. Human memory doesn't work like a recording device that accurately captures and preserves each and every detail of our experiences. Our mental resources are limited. We can't attend to every single detail of our experiences. If we did, our thinking would be incredibly slow, inefficient, and overburdened. So instead, our brains take shortcuts by focusing on what we think is most important and recording the overall gist of our experiences. You might remember some details, but you won't remember all of them, and it's easy to miss important information, especially when you're learning something new. For instance, you might remember attending a meeting, and you might recall having a discussion on some important topic and even the outcome of that discussion. But at the same time, you might have trouble recalling who exactly attended that meeting, who said what, and why you ultimately landed on that decision. Or in a history class, you might remember the end result of a war, but not the order of events that actually led up to it. Sometimes those details don't matter, but sometimes they do. Psychologists have also demonstrated that our memories are susceptible to various biases and errors. When we don't remember the details, our minds often automatically, without us even realizing, fill in the gaps based on other information and experiences we've had. This helps to explain why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable, even for the most confident witnesses. For example, research has shown that eyewitnesses can be easily primed to hold false memories by exposing them to misinformation or by presenting them with leading questions after the fact. People can be led to incorrectly remember everything from small details of a perpetrator's appearance to major details like whether someone was holding a weapon. In short, your memory isn't as trustworthy as you think it is. You should plan for it to let you down. Aside from preventing memory failures, taking your own notes helps you stay focused and engaged during the learning process. And it's better to take your own notes than to rely on someone else's notes. It's increasingly common for instructors to provide students with lecture slides, outlines, and handouts in class. Some publishers will also provide chapter summaries or note cards as learning supplements. And there are an increasing number of peer note-sharing websites. These resources can be beneficial as far as saving you time and helping you stay organized, but there are also several downsides. First and foremost, if you're relying on a peer's notes or notes you found online, there's no guarantee that they're accurate, complete, or trustworthy. So you have to proceed at your own risk. But the biggest downside is that relying on someone else's notes deprives you of some of the practice in thinking about the content. When you take your own notes, you're forced to make those decisions about what content is likely to be most important, and you get practice summarizing ideas in your own words. If you rely on someone else's notes, you may be less likely to pay attention or to make original connections to your own experiences and prior knowledge, which is what really helps information stick. Taking your own notes increases the likelihood that you are actively, rather than passively, participating in the learning process. And that's the second principle of effective note-taking, that it should be an active process. Effective note-taking goes beyond simply copying information from one place to another or recording a series of isolated facts. Effective note-taking means you're engaging with the content by listening, thinking, and determining what is most important information to record. Effective note-taking also involves recording ideas and questions you have about what you're learning and organizing the content in a way that makes it more meaningful or sensible to you. In other words, you should be consciously and deliberately choosing what to record and how to record it, even if that means going back after a lecture to reorganize, clarify, or elaborate on what you wrote. The third and final principle of effective note-taking is flexibility. There's no single best way to take notes, so you should be willing to try a variety of methods to find what works for you. The best method may also vary depending on the class and the content. For example, using an outline format might be an effective way to organize your notes on different psychological theories, but it might not work as well in, say, a literature class. You should also consider your instructor's expectations regarding the content of your notes. For example, if you will be assessed on exact dates and definitions, then your notes should certainly include them. But if you will be tested more on your ability to apply or explain ideas, then your notes should include examples and explanations instead, or the hows and whys, not just the whats. The way your instructor teaches may also influence your choice of format. Some instructors teach in very linear ways that are well suited for organizational structures like outlines, but other instructors teach in nonlinear ways that may make outlines less feasible, at least in the moment. In that case, you might just use a bulleted list to keep track of main ideas, which you can then organize later on. Related to flexibility and formatting, I often get asked whether it's better to take notes by hand or on a computer. Now, educators have been debating this ever since laptops were allowed into classrooms, and the research has provided mixed results. There's no universal consensus regarding whether note-taking on a laptop is better or worse than taking notes by hand. There are pros and cons to each. On the one hand, technology may provide some extra support. If you have awful handwriting or are just slow to write, then typing ensures that your notes are legible and may enable you to take notes faster, which means that you can record more information overall, or at least devote more time and mental energy to comprehending the content during the lecture, as opposed to rushing to write it all down. Technology can also make editing, organizing, storing, and sharing notes easier and more efficient. But taking electronic notes also comes with some potential disadvantages. Some researchers have found that taking notes electronically may encourage more passive and superficial learning. For instance, in a well-known study published in 2014, psychologists Pam Mueller and Daniel Oppenheimer found that students who took notes on a laptop were more likely to simply copy down what their instructor said verbatim, and they performed poorly on conceptual tests compared to students who took notes by hand. The students who took notes by hand were more likely, out of necessity, to condense the content into more manageable bits and to paraphrase it in their own words, which likely enabled them to process the content on a deeper level. But the biggest danger of using computers to take notes is the risk of multitasking. We all know that computers provide many tempting distractions, like email, social media, online shopping, news headlines, and other work vying for our attention. And multitasking is incredibly common. For instance, some research found that college students who use laptops in class were only working on class-related material about 58% of the time. And another study found that participants in a professional development training session were only on task 13% of the time while using their laptops. Perhaps not surprisingly, research shows that people who multitask take fewer and lower quality notes, are less likely to be engaged, and ultimately remember less content. And not only does electronic multitasking impede individual learning and performance, but research shows it also impairs the learning of other people in the room when they can see their peers doing it. So, in sum, the decision to take handwritten versus electronic notes should be made carefully based on a number of factors, including the extent to which it saves you time and makes it easier for you to meaningfully engage with the content versus the likelihood that it causes you to tune out, passively transcribe, or multitask. Remember the importance of staying actively engaged throughout the process. Now that we've covered some of the basic principles of effective note-taking, let's put them into practice by discussing some concrete strategies for taking notes in different contexts. One of the most common opportunities to take good notes is while you are reading. Textbooks are sometimes dry and boring, which can make it harder to pay attention to the content. But even engaging readings can mislead you into believing that you understand or that you'll remember the content better than you actually will. By taking good notes while you read, you'll force yourself to stay focused, increase the likelihood that you understand what you're reading, and you'll have a condensed version of the content that you can use to review and test your memory later on. Taking notes on readings prior to associated lectures will also enable you to follow along and to better understand the lecture material, since it won't be your first exposure to the content. Before you start reading, you should first skim the text and divide the reading into sections. Sometimes this is already done for you, as textbooks are usually split into units, chapters, and even subsections within those chapters. But if the reading assignment is particularly challenging, if sections are ill-defined, or if sections are still quite dense and lengthy, it would be useful for you to predetermine some breaking points. Remember, your mind can only process so much information at once, and passive note-taking, just like passive reading, is not very helpful to learning and retention. Effective note-taking requires active mental effort, and so you need to give yourself breaks, as well as time to pause and reflect on what you're learning. Once you've identified some key sections, you should take a few moments to consider what you already know about these topics and pre-identify any areas that you might need to devote some extra attention to. This will also help you gauge how many notes you should plan to take for each section and how detailed they should be. If provided, review the learning objectives to gauge your current level of background knowledge and understanding. Practice explaining beforehand the key ideas that you expect to find in the reading. I know this might sound counterintuitive. You are presumably reading to learn these ideas after all. But making the initial effort to predict the content will actually increase the likelihood that you attend to the substance and relevance of the text, even if your predictions were wrong. This is known as the generation effect, which shows that information is better remembered if it's generated from one's own mind rather than simply read. Making predictions activates a personal framework through which you will try to understand and integrate the new content. Next, while you're reading, you should take your time. Don't rush. Focus on reading for understanding, not just to get it done. Be prepared to look up unfamiliar words or to reread sections as needed. If desired, you can highlight or underline key points or add question marks or brief notations to sections that you want to review later on. Then, once you've completed a reading section, consider it as a whole. What was the main idea? What point was the author trying to explain? Without looking, summarize it in your own words and write it down. Aim for just a few sentences. You aren't giving a detailed account at this point, just an overview. And if you can't identify or explain the main idea in your own words or in just a few sentences, then read it again until you can. Once you've summarized the main ideas, then you should go back and skim the section for key details. This might include dates, names, terms, poignant examples, or anything else that might be important. Write down these details below your personal summary. Again, as much as possible, try to explain them in your own words, and use bullet points or some other method to distinguish each point. You might also record relevant page numbers in case you need to follow up. After you've recorded the key details from the text, next you should make your own additions to your notes. This may include adding personal examples related to the content, noting questions you had while reading or areas of confusion, or making connections to other things you've learned. It's useful to document what you were thinking while reading so that you don't have to go through that process each time you review the content. Plus, it gives you concrete reminders of what to follow up on. Don't assume that you'll remember what you were thinking or the questions you had, or even how you were connecting to the content later on. You should repeat this process for each section of the reading until you complete it. Thus, for each section of content, your notes will include a brief summary in your own words, a list of corresponding details or facts, and a list of personal comments and questions. And when you arrive at the end of the reading, you should practice summarizing the bigger picture as well. What were the overarching takeaways? This approach to note-taking while reading may be different from what you already do, and it may take more time than only underlining, highlighting, or transcribing sentences from the reading. But it ensures that you're really thinking about the content in multiple ways, which ultimately makes that time more worthwhile and increases the likelihood that you will retain it. Plus, the more care and effort you put into recording notes, the more useful they will be as a study tool later on. The strategies I just described for taking notes while reading also work well when it comes to taking notes from recorded lectures. If it's a long video, you can divide the lecture into time-stamped sections, pause to summarize and record ideas, and then rewatch different segments as needed. However, if you're taking notes during a live lecture or presentation where you don't have control over the pause button, you'll need to take a slightly different approach. The first step to taking good notes during a live class or lecture is to come prepared. This means you should preview the content that will be covered by reviewing the agenda, learning objectives, and any associated readings. If the lecture is a continuation of content, it may also be helpful to review your notes from the prior lecture to refresh your memory and help situate the new content. You'll find it easier to follow along if you know what to expect and where you might be unsure or confused, compared to if you're being exposed to the content for the very first time. So being prepared is important, but what you do during the lecture is just as important. In essence, you want to ensure that you're present, both physically and mentally. There's a difference between merely sensing a lecture and actually trying to interpret it. Again, you want to be an active listener and participant as much as possible. You want to take notes, but you don't want to get so caught up in writing things down that you miss out on the opportunity to actually think about the content. Our brains can only do so much at once, and if you're trying to transcribe a lecture word for word, you'll likely overload your working memory and attention, which will reduce your ability to think about the meaning of what you're learning. Instead of trying to transcribe everything, here's how you can take better notes during a live lecture presentation. First, when available, take advantage of outlines, sketch notes, or lecture slides that the instructor or presenter may offer in advance. All of these provide a basic organizational structure so that you can devote more of your attention to filling in the details, writing down key explanations and examples, and making notes of your own ideas and questions. If your instructor doesn't provide you with any organizational tools, you should come prepared with your own organizational strategy or plan. Again, there's no right or best format for taking notes. There are many different styles that can be used. What's important is that you find a method that works for you and that works for the content or the class. And don't be afraid to get creative. Draw arrows from one section to another, add illustrations, use symbols, even sketch doodles. Besides being fun, research has shown that drawing, compared to writing alone, has been found to boost retention and memory performance. And by the way, unless you're really handy with computer graphics applications, this is yet another advantage of handwritten notes. It's also a good idea to designate some space on the page to record your own ideas and questions, or space to add more information later on. This is especially important for any content that you have trouble understanding or keeping up with during the lecture. Whatever organizational format you use, you should practice paraphrasing and writing in shorthand. Your notes should not consist of complete sentences or paragraphs. Write in your own style and use your own words. You don't need to worry so much about spelling, grammar, or punctuation, or even neatness, as long as you can decipher your notes later on. And remember that you don't have to write down every single thing. Think about whether a point is noteworthy before you write it down. Otherwise, you'll end up with lengthy notes full of irrelevant details, which will distract you from the more important ones. Keep in mind that you can usually look up verbatim definitions afterwards, so focus more on summarizing the main ideas and recording any useful examples or anecdotes that your instructor provides. As for deciding exactly what to record, you should also look for important cues from your instructor. For example, introductory and concluding remarks often include overviews of main points. You can also listen for signal phrases such as, "There are 3 different explanations," or "The biggest criticism of this approach is," and though it may be obvious, anything that the instructor repeats multiple times or writes down on the board is also likely to be important and worthy of recording. At any rate, don't panic if you miss something. You can always ask your instructor to repeat a point during class or follow up with your instructor or a peer afterwards. Just add a reminder to yourself to do that. Once the in-class note-taking is over, there's still a bit more to do. Ideally, the same day, while the content's still fresh in your mind, you should start reviewing and editing your notes. Again, the more thought you put into this process, the more valuable it will be to your learning. Don't simply reread or recopy them. Instead, focus on editing them for clarity and understanding. This might involve rewriting illegible parts, reorganizing certain sections, creating new diagrams or visuals that show connections among ideas, or adding more information to clarify ideas or to answer any questions you had. You might refer back to the assigned readings, talk to a classmate, or ask the instructor follow-up questions to facilitate this process. Research also shows that comparing your notes with someone else's notes or directly asking the instructor for feedback on your notes can be useful as well, especially if it was the first lecture in a new course. Alternatively, you can wait for a major assessment to help determine how useful your notes were. But it's better to be proactive about it and ask for that feedback early on. So to review the 3 principles of effective note-taking, whether you're reading or listening to a lecture, first, you should assume that you will forget and take notes. Taking notes will not only provide you with useful memory cues, but will help you stay focused and engaged during the learning process itself. Second, note-taking should never be a passive or automated process. You should be thoughtful about how you record them and what you record. This includes organizing your notes in a meaningful way, paraphrasing and explaining ideas in your own words, and connecting the content to your own experiences and prior knowledge. And the third principle is to remain flexible and open to adjusting your approach based on the content, learning objectives, and how well it is working for you. Like any other academic skill, you can get better at note-taking with deliberate practice and feedback, but it does take some effort and experimentation. With that being said, I want to end with an important reminder. How you take notes or what you do during the note-taking process is important, but so is what you do with those notes or how you use them to prepare for assessments. You should not rely on simply rereading or recopying your notes. Doing those things might generate a feeling of familiarity, but familiarity does not equal mastery. Instead, you want to use your notes to actively test yourself. For instance, create flashcards, or ask someone else to quiz you over your notes, or cover sections of your own notes and see how much you can recall without looking. Practice defining key terms, writing formulas, solving problems, and providing explanations, whatever you will be asked to do on the actual assessment. And then use your thoughtful, detailed, and well-organized notes to compare your answers, correct any inaccuracies, and check for gaps. Doing all of these things will ensure that the notes you've taken are put to the best possible use, enriching and increasing your engagement during the learning process, and also helping you to retain that information in the long term.